Well, hello there, YouTube. Welcome to Monday's edition of The Breakfast Club. I'm Got That Funk. I'd like to thank you for joining me. I wanted to talk a little bit about immigration and assimilation. Most of the time when people have foreigners coming into their country, people tend to say that the foreigners should make some attempt to assimilate to their new culture. As an immigrant myself, I can see the wisdom of assimilation up to a point. But I wanted to talk a little bit about what people mean when they say assimilate. Assimilate to what exactly? That's my main issue. There's no normal way to be an American, for example. So when there are so many different types of Americans who were born in America, that you can't say that there is any American way to dress or American way to conduct yourself. Basically, the only thing that most Americans have in common is most Americans, not all, but most Americans speak English as their first language. Now, I do think it's prudent for an immigrant to learn the language of the host country that they're moving into. I think it's prudent for their own benefit and obviously for the benefit of those with whom they interact. But ultimately, I believe in freedom of speech, and that has to include language by definition, I would have thought. And so if someone chooses to make their own life more difficult for themselves by not learning to speak the language of their host country, that's on them. That's their problem. And I don't really think people should be overly aggrieved by this. They're not making anyone's life harder more than they're making their own life harder by refusing to learn the local language. And some people have reasons why they don't necessarily want to adopt their host country's language, even if they decide to live there for the rest of their lives. It's not my place to tell anybody whether their reasons are right or wrong. I do think, like I say, that it's prudent to learn the local language if you're going to move to a country. But I don't think it should be forced. I don't think it should be the law. I don't think it should be a condition upon which entry can be denied if you don't already speak the language that is predominant in your new culture. Okay? That's just my opinion, and feel free to disagree with me. I'm sure plenty of people will in the comment section. But overall, I really want to drive home the point that there is no sort of real norm to assimilate to in most Western cultures. And how much is too much to ask? Going back for a moment to the language example, when someone moves to a new country and they learn the language of that country either before or shortly after they arrive, that's making their own life an awful lot easier for sure. But yes, it's also making it easier for the people who they're around who are already native to that country. And I think this, to me, is a little bit germane to the whole point of why people say you ought to assimilate Mr. or Mrs. Immigrant. Because when they're talking about assimilation, they're not really normally talking about the immigrant making their own life easier. They're talking about the immigrant making their impact on their country easier for them. In other words, assimilation isn't for the benefit of the immigrant, it's for the benefit of the host country and its citizens. And is that right? When you're born native to a country, you are going to take on some cultural norms. That's just inevitable. But it's also true that you have the freedom to resist, reject, or not conform to those norms. And you should have that freedom. So why should people who are coming from the outside not also have the same freedom of and latitude in the way they exercise their self-expression? For example, in terms of the way they dress. Okay? One objection I hear an awful lot is that people shouldn't necessarily be walking around in a face veil or whatever. And I've got certain objections to covering the face in certain public places, and I think there's definitely some public places where it's not appropriate. But simply walking down the street, I think a person should be allowed and even expected to dress however the fuck they want, and no one else really gets to have a say. And if you don't like it, that's tough, and that goes for people who are dressed really loudly or people who are trying to dress, from their point of view, modestly. Now, when it comes to covering the face in public, I personally think there are some places where that's not appropriate. I can name them all for you. There's 5 places: at an airport, in a hospital, in a school, in a bank, and in court. I think in those places, people should be required, whether they like it or not, to show their face. Outside of those places, I think liberty should take precedent, and people should be allowed to cover their face if they want to. And I'm well aware of all the arguments about the oppression of women and so forth and whatever. That's a different subject. What I'm talking about is people choosing to wear what they want to wear for their own benefit and for their own reasons, not if it's being forced on them, but if it's a free choice. No one should be forced to wear any particular kind of garment. Neither should they be forced not to wear it, for exactly the same set of reasons. So, when it comes to assimilating into a host culture, how much is too much to ask of an immigrant? And when you say assimilate to the foreigner in your country, what do you expect them to actually do? What is it about them or their lifestyle that you expect them to change in order to be considered to have assimilated into your culture? Give it some thought and let me know what you think down below in the comment section. I look forward to an interesting debate. I hope Sister Danger's here for tomorrow's episode of The Breakfast Club, but if not, I've got a parachute person on standby, so we'll see what happens. Anyways, until next time, may all your ups and downs be ups.